Sermon on the Mount might be the most fascinating of all the passages in the Bible. On the surface, it looks so straightforward and simple. Jesus is telling us how to live, how to be blessed, and to take his teachings and put them into practice like a man building his house on a rock instead of one building his house on sand. But when you get into the details of this sermon, it is a bear to interpret and apply. And then you add on to that the whole question relating to the timing of when Jesus delivered this teaching. The Jews were still under the Mosaic law. The church was just about to be established a few years later. And then you have Jesus talking about a coming future kingdom. So is this teaching for the Mosaic law time period to help illustrate how all those under the law can't measure up? Is it about how we are supposed to live today in the church age? Are these the ethics or the principles for this day? Or is this about the kingdom that Jesus will establish at his return? So you put all of this together when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount, and for these reasons, it can be kind of complicated. And so I always enjoy hearing or reading other people talk about how they interpret this sermon, even if I don't agree with them on everything. It's always a fascinating journey to walk through someone else with the Sermon on the Mount. And today's review is a book called The Sermon on the Mount. The Government Shall Be Upon His Shoulders by Jon Tretsven. Now, this is a 2024 self-published work. It's not available on Amazon, so if you want to get a copy of this, you'll have to check out my Facebook group, Rev Reads on Facebook, where a PDF of this self-published book will be freely available in the Rev Reads Facebook group. But John comes to this sermon in its context in the Gospel of Matthew. And then he walks the reader through the sermon with a strong emphasis on the literary structure that's used throughout the sermon. And if you have a few minutes, I would love to tell you about my thoughts on The Sermon on the Mount by Jon Tretsven. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to understand the teachings of Jesus Christ, please subscribe to the channel in order to stay up to date with my most current reviews. Also, please like this video, give it a share to help other people know about John's work. And I want to say a huge thank you to the Buy Me a Coffee members. Your support is what allows me to cover the costs to continue to put out these reviews on a regular basis. And if you're someone who has benefited from Rev Reads, I would love for you to consider supporting the channel at a beginning membership price of only $3 a month. I love the phrase that John uses to describe the Sermon on the Mount. He calls the Sermon on the Mount a campaign speech. Here is Jesus coming to tell Israel the good news that the kingdom is at hand. And then he goes on to deliver a campaign speech for his kingdom. Now, if you can guess based on where John is going with that language, the kingdom is what will happen when Jesus returns to establish his rule that premillennialists call the Millennial Kingdom. And John sees the Sermon on the Mount as Jesus's campaign speech, proclaiming how people will live and how he will govern when he rules. This places the Sermon on the Mount in the future for when Christ comes back. Now, that doesn't mean that we can just take the sermon and throw it away because it's for a future time, because the sermon also tells us the ideals of how we should live, how life is intended to be right now. For instance, take Jesus' series of statements where he taught, "It has been said, whoever sends his wife away," or "you shall not make false vows." And then Jesus showed how the demands of his kingdom are higher and much farther reaching. He isn't here writing a new law for the Jews in order to teach them how to maintain the requirements of the Mosaic law, or even showing them how the law was always intended to be understood. Instead, Jesus is saying, here is what my law requires. Here are the standards for my coming Kingdom, which means that if you want to live in line with God's will for his people, we're going to strive to follow Jesus' words today, even if we recognize that there's parts of this sermon that are just unattainable in the fallen world as it is right now. And I really like John's point that part of the understanding of the Sermon on the Mount is coming to see that there are sections of this, and I think this is pretty widely understood, that there are just parts of this sermon that are impossible. There are key parts of it that cannot be lived out without divine enforcement. So while we can glean various things from this campaign speech for our lives today, we also recognize that it's not for today. This is the time when we're living under the grace of the church age and we're not living under the millennial kingdom. I think the best part of this book, though, and I've probably made about a dozen highlights over the course of a few pages, was when John dealt with how the Christian relates to the law. His main point, as I kind of touched on earlier, is that Jesus is not reinterpreting the Mosaic law. He is not demonstrating ways that we're supposed to live out the Mosaic law today. Instead, he's showing his superiority to the law. We see a lot of this type of teaching in the letter to the Hebrews. The law is a decaying copy of the superior that is in the heavenly. And that's why we're not under it at all today. And I loved what he wrote about Jesus fulfilling the law. How did Jesus fulfill? Not by perfectly keeping Moses' law. Jesus fulfilled because he's the reality the law copied. In contrast to the imperfect law, he's the perfect image of God. His sermon, his entire ministry, fulfilled the law and the prophets and achieved eternal redemption, but not by keeping the law. John also has this list on the law based on scriptural verses on page 46 of this work. He has 18 facts about the law, such as we're not under Aaron's priesthood and the law can't make us sons. It's a really great list to help us see how the New Testament overall wants us to view the law of the Old Testament. So I did really like this book. Is it perfect? No. Do I agree with everything that's in it? No, I don't. It has some typos like one would expect to find in a self-published book, but I prefer to show some grace when I'm reading those, and I hope you would do the same. I also think at times John puts a little bit too much emphasis on the structure of the sermon. There are a few places where he draws attention to chiasms or other structures, and I'm like, I don't know if I really see that, John. But overall, this really surpassed my expectation. It was a really enjoyable time walking through the Sermon on the Mount with him again. And I think even some of those places where I disagreed with him made it all the more enjoyable. And then spending that time thinking through, should I really view this as a campaign speech, which just made it fun to go through with him and a little impactful also about how I should be living it out today. So the next time that you study through the Sermon on the Mount, make John's book one of the guides that you read as you're going through what may be the world's greatest campaign speech.